In 1971, Richard Nixon made a decision that gave the United States almost unlimited financial power over every country on Earth. For 50 years, no one could stop it. No one even came close. But right now, for the first time in modern history, a coalition of nations is systematically dismantling that power. They're doing it quietly, they're doing it deliberately, and most people in the West have absolutely no idea it's happening. If they succeed, and the data suggests they're closer than anyone wants to admit, the world you wake up in 5 years from now will look nothing like the one you live in today. This is the story of how the dollar became the most powerful weapon ever created, and the story of how it's being taken apart, piece by piece. Before we get into the history and the geopolitics, I need to make something clear, because this isn't abstract. This isn't something happening in boardrooms and government buildings that doesn't touch your life. The US dollar, being the world's reserve currency, is the single reason why Americans, and by extension most Western citizens, have enjoyed a standard of living that is historically unprecedented. It's why the US can run a $33 trillion debt and still have people lining up to buy its bonds. It's why inflation in America, even at its worst recently, was manageable compared to what happens when smaller countries lose control of their currency. The dollar's dominance is the invisible subsidy that props up your mortgage rate, keeps import prices stable, and allows your government to spend money it doesn't have without immediate consequence. When that changes, and I said when, not if, the cost of living shock will make 2022 inflation look like a warm-up act. So pay attention, because this is the most important geopolitical and economic story of the next decade. And it starts, as most things do, with a war. The year is 1944. World War II is in its final brutal chapter. Europe is in ruins. Asia is in flames. And 44 nations send their representatives to a small resort town in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods. They're not there to talk about the war. They're there to design what comes after. They're there to build the financial architecture of the post-war world. And the deal they strike is simple but staggering in its implications. Every country's currency will be pegged to the US dollar. Fixed exchange rates, stability, predictability, exactly what a war-shattered global economy needs to rebuild. And the dollar itself will be backed by gold. 1 ounce of gold equals 35 US dollars. You can take your dollars to the US Treasury and exchange them for gold, guaranteed. This makes sense at the time. The United States holds approximately 75% of the world's monetary gold reserves. They financed the war. They have the factories. They have the gold. The dollar, being the anchor currency of the global economy, is simply a reflection of reality. And for 25 years, it works. The post-war economic boom, the rebuilding of Europe through the Marshall Plan, the rise of global trade, all of it runs on dollars. But then something goes wrong. By the late 1960s, America is spending money it doesn't have. The Vietnam War is expensive. The Great Society social programs are expensive. And foreign governments, particularly France under Charles de Gaulle, who deeply distrusted American financial dominance, start demanding their gold back. They take their dollars to Washington and say, "We want the gold you promised." And Nixon has a problem, because the gold isn't there, not in the quantities needed to honor every dollar in circulation. So on August 15, 1971, in a Sunday evening television address, Richard Nixon tells the world that the United States is suspending the convertibility of the dollar to gold. Just like that. No international agreement, no negotiation. The deal made in Bretton Woods, unilaterally torn up. This moment is known as the Nixon shock, and it should have ended dollar dominance forever. It didn't, because Nixon and his Secretary of State Henry Kissinger had already engineered a replacement system, one that was arguably even more powerful than gold backing. They called it the Petrodollar. Here's the deal Nixon and Kissinger made with Saudi Arabia, and eventually with every major OPEC nation in 1973 and 1974. Saudi Arabia agrees to sell its oil exclusively in US dollars. Every barrel of oil, anywhere in the world, priced and settled in dollars. In exchange, the United States provides Saudi Arabia with military protection and weapons. Think about what this means. If Japan wants to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, and Japan has no oil, so it has to, Japan first needs to acquire US dollars. It doesn't matter that Japan and Saudi Arabia have nothing to do with America in that transaction. The dollar is the mandatory middleman for every single energy transaction on Earth. And since every country on Earth needs energy, every country on Earth needs dollars, which means every country on Earth has a permanent structural demand for US currency. This is the real foundation of American economic power, not gold, not military might alone. The fact that the entire global energy market runs on dollars means the United States can print money in a way no other country can, and export the inflation to the rest of the world. It means American consumers get cheaper imports. American companies can borrow at lower rates. The US government can run deficits that would bankrupt any other country. For 50 years, this system has been essentially untouchable, until now. In 2009, 4 countries, Brazil, Russia, India and China, held their first formal summit under the acronym BRICS. South Africa joined in 2010, making it BRICS. At the time, Western analysts treated it largely as a talking shop, an economic curiosity, not a serious geopolitical force. They were wrong. In August 2023, BRICS held its most significant summit in Johannesburg, South Africa. And what happened there sent a quiet shockwave through every finance ministry and central bank in the Western world. BRICS announced the addition of 6 new members: Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Argentina. And more than 40 additional countries had formally applied or expressed interest in joining. Let that sink in. Saudi Arabia, the cornerstone of the petrodollar system, was invited into a bloc explicitly organized around reducing dependence on the US dollar. The de-dollarization movement is no longer a fringe idea. It is now the stated policy goal of nations representing more than 40% of the global population and a rapidly growing share of global GDP. Here's what they're actually doing. Not just talking about, but doing. China and Russia have been settling bilateral trade in yuan and rubles since 2022, completely bypassing the dollar. The volume of their non-dollar trade has increased by over 80% since the Ukraine war began, and Western sanctions were imposed on Moscow. China and Saudi Arabia completed their first oil trade settled in Chinese yuan in 2023. It was a relatively small transaction, but it was the first crack in the petrodollar wall in 50 years. India has been negotiating oil purchases from Russia in rupees. It's been buying discounted Russian oil, sanctioned oil that it technically shouldn't be buying, and paying in its own currency. Washington has protested. India has continued. Brazil and China, the first and second largest economies in their respective continents, announced they would conduct trade directly in their own currencies, eliminating dollar conversion entirely. And underneath all of this sits a longer-term project, a BRICS common currency, or at minimum, a shared payment system that roots around SWIFT, the Western-controlled financial messaging network that the US has used as a weapon to sanction Russia, Iran, and others. The goal isn't to destroy the dollar overnight. The goal is to build parallel infrastructure, parallel payment systems, parallel currency reserves, parallel trade relationships, so that over time the dollar becomes optional rather than mandatory. And optional is a very different world. Washington is not sitting still, and it would be lazy analysis to pretend the United States doesn't still hold enormous advantages. The dollar still represents approximately 58% of global foreign exchange reserves, down from over 70% 2 decades ago, but still dominant. US Treasury bonds are still the world's safe haven asset. The US military is still unmatched. English is still the language of global finance and law. The Federal Reserve's ability to set global interest rates is still the most powerful macroeconomic lever on earth. When the Fed raises rates, capital flows back to America from emerging markets, regardless of what those countries want. And here's the uncomfortable truth about BRICS that its proponents often gloss over. The bloc has deep internal contradictions. India and China have fought border wars. Brazil's commitment fluctuates with its domestic politics. Many of the new members, including Saudi Arabia, are still deeply integrated into dollar-based systems and aren't ready to walk away. Building a credible alternative reserve currency requires something that's very hard to manufacture: trust. And trust requires transparent institutions, rule of law, and a track record of not weaponizing your currency. China, for all its economic power, has not yet demonstrated that it will let the yuan trade freely without capital controls. That is a fundamental obstacle, so the dollar isn't dying tomorrow. Anyone who tells you it is selling something. But the direction of travel is clear, and the pace is accelerating. So let's bring this home. What does this actually mean for ordinary people in Western countries? In the short term, the next 2 to 3 years, the most direct impact is on inflation and interest rates. As global demand for dollars gradually softens, the US loses some of its ability to export inflation. That means domestic prices face more upward pressure. It means the Federal Reserve has less room to maneuver. It also means oil prices become more volatile and less predictable. When oil trades in multiple currencies, the pricing mechanism becomes more complex. Complexity in energy markets historically means higher prices for consumers. For investors, the implications are significant. A gradually weakening dollar is historically good for gold, commodities, and non-dollar assets. It's one reason why central banks globally bought more gold in 2022 and 2023 than in any year since 1967. They are quietly diversifying away from dollar reserves. When central banks move, it is worth paying attention. For anyone holding significant cash savings in dollars or euros, the long-term purchasing power risk is real and growing. This doesn't mean panic, it means awareness. It means understanding that the financial architecture your parents and grandparents built their wealth inside may look meaningfully different by the time you retire. The countries that navigate this transition best will be the ones that saw it coming, the ones that diversify their assets, their trade relationships, their strategic reserves. The ones that don't will wake up one day wondering why everything costs twice as much and why nobody warned them. Consider this your warning. Let me give you 3 scenarios for how this plays out over the next decade, not predictions, possibilities. Because anyone who claims certainty here is lying. Scenario 1. Managed multipolar transition. The dollar gradually declines from 58% of global reserves to somewhere around 40–45%. The yuan, euro, and a basket of other currencies absorb the difference. SWIFT faces real competition from Chinese and BRICS developed alternatives. Oil continues to be priced partially in dollars, but other currencies gain ground. This is the soft landing. It's uncomfortable for the US, but not catastrophic. It's probably the most likely scenario. Scenario 2. Dollar crisis triggered by US debt. The US national debt crosses $40 trillion, a credibility crisis in US fiscal management, perhaps a messy debt ceiling standoff, perhaps a credit rating collapse, triggers a sudden loss of confidence in treasuries. Foreign holders start selling, the Fed is forced to monetize the debt, inflation spikes, the dollar's reserve status collapses faster than anyone modeled. This scenario was considered fringe 5 years ago. It is now discussed seriously in mainstream financial institutions. Scenario 3. The system holds. American military and economic power proves more durable than the challengers anticipated. BRICS fractures over internal rivalries. China's economy struggles under its property crisis and demographic collapse. The dollar remains dominant simply because there is no credible alternative. History is full of predicted collapses that never came. This outcome remains possible. The honest answer is that elements of all 3 scenarios are already unfolding simultaneously. What I can tell you with confidence is this: the 75-year era of unquestioned dollar dominance is over. What replaces it, and how quickly, is the defining geopolitical and economic question of our time. And that is exactly what we're here to answer, every single week. If this is your first time here, this channel is called Capital and Power. Every week we take the biggest geopolitical and economic shifts on the planet and break down exactly what they mean, why they happened, and what comes next. No noise, no partisan spin, just the clearest analysis we can give you. The question I want to leave you with today is this: if the dollar loses its reserve status in your lifetime, which scenario do you think plays out? Managed transition, crisis, or does the system hold? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And if this video gave you something to think about, you know what to do. See you next week.